a do-gooder and a storyteller, and lives in Holland, Michigan. And so, Steve Falvo, if you're ready, come on down.
Thanks, Gloria. Well, looks like we've got a great crowd tonight. Tonight I'd like to tell you about a Christmas visitor. Now, we're not too far removed from the Christmas season. Possibly you're all worn out on the Christmas topic, but I want to take you back, and hopefully this story will be worth it. When I was a boy, my grandparents had a dairy farm. It was a small dairy farm. They milked at the most 60 cows. They had 160 acres, and I spent in my youth probably about 20 Christmases at their house. And I'll just tell you up front, I never saw a Christmas tree at their house, ever, through all those years. But don't panic, they did have a tradition, a Christmas tradition. They had a Santa sleigh in their living room every year. And I remember being a small boy and walking in the first time and seeing that Santa sleigh. It was pretty large. It's probably about quarter scale. It was red. I think my grandfather had made it out of plywood and painted it red. And it was big enough that 2 kids could sit in it. And they would, I had metal runners on it. And my grandma had set it up with 8 deer out in front of it, inflatable deer. And they were hooked on with leather harnesses that had bells on them. And she'd garnished it with some cottony looking substance that looked like snow, and had multicolored lights lit up on it. And as Christmas arrived, the back of the sleigh would be heaping full of presents, and it was quite exciting. And it was different than traditions that I was used to at home. And so I want to relate one particular Christmas that I remember, one of the earlier ones that I spent with my grandparents. My mom was a recently divorced single mom at that point, and my younger brother Spencer and I we went over to their house, my grandparents' house, on a Christmas Eve. We got there after supper. It was probably maybe 5 or 5:30. I'm not exactly sure what the purpose of our visit was, but I know there was a big meal the next day, and I know that my mom was helping my grandmother cook up a number of things. And it started snowing outside, and was snowing kind of hard, and they were working on their preparations, and my brother and I were just enjoying being out on the farm. And eventually it got later, and it was time to go home. It was about 9 o'clock, and my grandpa came in from out at the barn. Now, one thing that was a little bit different about how they ran things, when I think my grandpa was running the farm by himself, they milked cows early in the morning, and then in the afternoon they would milk them again. Later, my uncle joined my grandpa in the farming business, and over time they milked the cows later and later in the morning, and later in the evening. So they were out milking cows, and my grandpa had just come in. His job was to feed the cows, clean the barn, help out with miscellaneous things, and my uncle did the majority of the milking. So my grandpa comes in around 9 o'clock, and he says, "Oh, you're still here? I'm surprised. It's snowing like crazy out there. I don't know that it's going to be safe for you to go home." And my grandma kind of latched onto that. Oh, maybe you should stay overnight. I think you should stay. And my brother, yeah, let us stay. Now, this is Christmas Eve, mind you. And so eventually my mom, and she's here tonight listening to this, she thought about it a little bit, kind of hem-hawed back and forth, but eventually she said, "Well, okay, I guess we'll stay." And yeah, so my brother and I are really happy. And my grandma goes, and she decides my brother and I are going to sleep on the sofa. And she goes and gets some linens for that, and sets them up on the sofa. But she doesn't call it a sofa. She calls it a Davenport. And so she sets up a sheet on the Davenport, a sheet on the bottom, a sheet on the top, a couple blankets, a pillow on each end. My brother and I are going to sleep on opposite ends of it. My mom's going to sleep in the spare bedroom. And my brother and I are quite happy about this turn of events. And so my mom and my grandma are out in the kitchen and they're talking. And I don't know what they were talking about. The lights got turned down. My brother and I had a snack, and we can see the sleigh there, and the lights are on, and I'm looking at the reindeer, just enjoying the ambiance. And my mom and grandma are talking in the background, and to me, that's kind of therapeutic. I liked hearing my mom talk and my grandma, and just hearing their voices made you feel safe. And even today, I enjoy hearing my wife talk. She can be on the phone talking to somebody, I don't know who, and it's just therapeutic for me. So I was enjoying all that, and about 10 o'clock, my grandpa came back in. He'd finished up his chores, and he went into his room and was changing his clothes, taking off his overalls. He always wore overalls unless he was dressing up to go somewhere. And about 10:30, my uncle came into the house. He was done with milking and cleaning up the milk parlor, and he went upstairs. He lived upstairs, and it wasn't too long later that we heard a knock at the door. Knock, 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 knock. And this was very unusual. My grandparents lived in southern Michigan. They lived on State Route 127. They were the first house on the east side of the road across the line from the Ohio border. And there were no towns very nearby. Now during the day, sometimes they would get a visitor, but it wasn't very often. But certainly at night, a visitor was rare. And so my grandma called to my grandpa, Lawrence, somebody's at the door. Go answer the door. Hold on, Ma, I got to get my overalls back on. And so my grandpa, a moment later, comes kind of gimping out. He's heading for the door. He's got arthritis bad in both knees. But he gets to the door, and when he gets there, he kind of puts a stern expression on his face, and he opens up the door. And, yeah, what do you want? And there's a guy outside, and he's all covered in snow. He's got a coat on, all covered in snow, and he says, sorry to bother you. My vehicle, I got my car stuck out in the road. It's kind of sideways. I'm wondering if you can help me out at all. I know it's late, it's Christmas Eve, sorry to bother you. And my grandpa thinks about it and says, well, come on in. And he opens up the door and lets him in. And I can tell my grandma isn't too happy about it at the time, but my grandpa goes over to the stairwell and calls up to my uncle, George, come on down and go out to the barn and get the Mini. Well, the Mini was the Minneapolis Moline. My grandpa had purchased a brand new Minneapolis Moline in 1952, and it was their biggest, strongest tractor that they had on the farm, 73 horsepower. A few years later, they did buy a bigger, more powerful tractor, but for their whole farming career up until that point, that was their biggest tractor. And I think when I think back on it, I think that's the only piece of equipment that I ever recall my grandparents ever buying new, was that Minneapolis tractor. And it kind of suited my grandpa. It was a very stout tractor. So my uncle, a moment later, got downstairs, and he went out to the barn. And about 5 minutes later, you heard the Mini coming up through the barnyard. And they're orange in color, and it was a tricycle that had a narrow front end and wide tires on the back. And he got it up there, and when they got up there, my grandpa and the man went out. The stranger went out with him, and they climbed onto the back of the Mini. Now the Mini in the winter, they would use it to haul grain to town a lot of times, which was about 5 miles away. And so it had a heat house on it. Didn't have a cab on it, but a heat house was like a canvas apparatus, and you put a panel on the right side of the tractor up by the engine, and it would come all the way back to the fenders, and there was one on the left side, and it would come all the way back to the fenders, and it would kind of channel the air from the engine, the hot air from the engine, back to the driver of the tractor. And it had some isinglass, like plastic windows, around the front of it, but no roof. So they all climbed on the tractor, and you could hear the tractor take off. And my brother and I would run up to the window, and we're looking out the window, and we can see it. The house is up on a hill, kind of a big hill, and then the driveway is like a level lower. And they were driving out through the driveway, and they got out to the road, and we ran out to the front of the house and in the spare bedroom, and we're looking out windows, and we can see them going down the road. They go past the house to the south, and they get about as far as we can see, but we can still hear them, and we can kind of see the lights a little bit. And they stop. You know, we're imagining they're getting off the tractor, hooking up the chain, and the man's getting in his car. And pretty soon we can see that car backing up. We can see the headlights come back up onto the road as the tractor's pulling it up on the highway. And then they stop. We figure that they're probably unhooking the chains, and pretty soon the car's driving along the road again. But it's driving kind of funny. If you watch, the headlights are going to the left, they're going to the right, they're going to the left and the right, and you can hear the wheels spinning and the engine revving on the car. You can tell he's having trouble driving down the road. There's so much snow. And he gets up about even with the house and a little bit past the house, and then the car headlights go over to the side again, and he's stuck. And pretty soon the Mini comes up there and stops for a minute, and we're waiting. My brother and I were got our noses pressed up against the window, the cold window, looking out. And then we can see the Minneapolis is starting to come back up into the driveway, and the car is following it. They're towing the car back up into the driveway. And they get it up at the top of the driveway, and they stop, they unhook it, and the tractor goes out to the barn, and my grandpa and the stranger come back in the house. My grandpa comes in, they're all covered with snow. He says, "Ma, Mr. Winter's here. He's going to have to stay the night. The roads are too snow covered for him to be able to drive home." And I can tell my grandma isn't too thrilled about it, but there's really nothing to be done. And so they come in, and a while later my uncle comes in, and this turns into, you know, before my brother and I were geared up for bedtime, but now we're geared up for visiting and another snack. So we go out to the kitchen, my grandma makes up some cocoa, we have some cookies, and we're talking with Mr. Winter, and he says that they thought, how far do you have to go? Do you have to go to Jackson or something? He goes, "No, I live quite a ways north from there." And my grandma says, "Oh, you better call your family." He says, "Well, it's getting pretty late. They're expecting me to get home, much later. They're probably in bed. I don't want to disturb them. I'll just call them in the morning." So at that point, the plans for sleeping arrangements change a little bit. My brother and I end up on one end of the Davenport, and my mom ends up on the other end of the Davenport, and the Mr. Winters ends up in the spare bedroom. So then the lights go down, everybody's gone off to bed, and my brother falls asleep very quickly. I'm planning to admire the sleigh and the presents and the lights from the sled, but I can't stay awake very long either, and I fall asleep. And the next thing I know, it's morning, Christmas morning, and it's exciting. And my brother and I, we get up, and we're kind of messing around in the living room and making noise, and my mom's like, "Shh, shh, shh, be quiet." And we get quiet for just a little bit, but it's not very long before we're making noise again. And she's like, "Shh, shh." But you know how kids are, you kind of want to, not be that quiet. We don't want to wait forever for Christmas to commence. So we're increasingly louder and louder. But I noticed that the door, as we're kind of tooling around the living room, I noticed the door to the spare bedroom's open. And I go over and kind of peeking in there, and wait a minute, there's nobody in there. Mr. Winters isn't in there. So I go out, and I look at the window to the driveway, and his car's gone. So, eventually my grandpa and uncle wake up, and we have a quick breakfast. They go off to milk the cows earlier than usual, and my mom and grandma are working on the dinner preparation. And eventually the meal is made, lunchtime arrives, and we have this fantastic lunch or Christmas dinner that my mom and grandma put together, and then it was finally time to open presents. So we go over to the sleigh, and my brother and I have kind of scoped out the presents, the lay of the land on the presents there. And first thing that is pulled off is this card. And we hadn't really noticed that. I don't know if it was there or not, because we hadn't really been looking for cards at that. You know, I was 9, my brother was 6. We're looking more at presents. And so they open up the card. It said to the Winsler family. And it was a card that said, Mr. and Mrs. Winsler, thank you for your hospitality. Thanks for pulling me out of the ditch and giving me a place to sleep. And we wish you the best of Christmases, you and your family. And there was a $100 bill in it, and said Mr. Winters, and Mr. Winter. And so he must have left that before he left. So we started opening up presents, and a few things are open, and one small package was open, and it had some D-cell batteries in it. I think 8 D-cell batteries. But nothing really went with it. And you know how sometimes that happens where things get out of order a little bit with the batteries, and then people are wondering, where do these go? So it was one of those moments. But as presents got opened, we kind of forgot about it because nothing that required batteries really got opened. And eventually we got to the last present that was in the sled, and it was a big present, but it was for my grandpa. It was a new set of coveralls that he could wear when he was driving to town 5 miles away, and it was in a big box. But behind that box, and we hadn't noticed this before, was a new addition. There was another good-sized box, and it said, to Steve and Spencer from Santa. And so my brother and I got that box, and we started tearing it open. And as it turned out, it was kind of one of those presents of gifts of the year that at least young boys like to get. It was, I believe, Mattel Sizzler's racetrack set. And the way that thing worked was it had a racetrack set up and cars, but they were battery-powered cars. It had like an onboard battery, but you charged up the battery with these things that looked like fuel tanks, gas station fuel tanks. And there was a red button on the top, and you put 4 D-cell batteries into it, and it had what looked like a hose coming out of the side, but it was really a wire, and you plugged it into the Sizzler, and you'd push this red button on the top and hold that for a minute or so, and then you'd unplug it and put it back on the track, and it would race for a while until it ran down, then you'd grab it off the track and do it all over again. And my brother and I were so excited to get that Sizzler racetrack and enjoyed it a lot. Now, a couple things. When my grandpa came in, he had said that as he was coming back from the barn, he walked out to where that car had been setting, and he saw the tracks where all 4 wheels had been setting, but he didn't see where the car had driven out the driveway. And the driveway would go down, cut down through the hill, so that the banks were probably at their peak, probably almost 4 feet high on each side. And there was a couple feet of snow. He didn't see any tracks through there. Wasn't sure how that all happened. Later, my brother and I, from my grandparents, had received a metal runner sled, and we were out there by the house where the hill was high, and we'd go down the hill to the driveway, and it swooped down and back up, and we were using that sled a lot, and I don't recall seeing any tracks out there either. So it turned out to be a really neat Christmas. One other thing that occurred after that, every Christmas since then, until probably only about 10 years ago, underneath our Christmas tree, there would be one present for myself and one present for my brother that said, to Steve or to Spencer from Santa. And I'm 100% positive that every one of those presents came from my mom. But that first present, that Sizzler track, who's to say? I'm not sure. So thank you.
Oh, nice story. Oh.